Hey all, and welcome to the Take 10 podcast. So excited that you are joining us. This is episode number 12, and I just need to start out by saying that I'm sorry. My recording schedule has not been as consistent as I would have liked and have promised for you all, and I apologize about that. There's just been a few things that are going on in my life that have kind of impacted my recording, and that's not an excuse or anything like that, but I did just want to share that so that you have a bit of a better understanding about some of the things that are going on. And so in episode number 10, we talked about trusting your stuff. And in that episode, I talked about, potentially making some career moves. And so I can't remember if at the time I had already resigned from my employer my if I was in the process of thinking about it. But long story short, in August, I did end up resigning from my prior employer, and was kind of going through the process of, getting my resume ready and applying for all these jobs. And long story short, had gone through the interview process with a few companies and had a few second interviews, and ultimately last week did receive a job offer, which starts very soon, and it is going to take me from the Phoenix area to the Salt Lake City area. And so it's just been a mad dash of trying to get ready and prepared to move in a short time. And so it's been a little bit stressful, and long story short, again, I just haven't put as much time into recording as I should have. So sorry about that. I will be more consistent in getting these things out and carving out time to make sure that I'm getting you content in a timely manner. So, all right, that's enough about me. It is a beautiful day, and I hope that you are having a beautiful day whenever you come across this. If you're watching this, you're going to notice that my traditional uniform, my blue shirt, has been replaced by this red one. And I'm a little bit self-conscious about that because I've always worn a blue shirt, especially in the videos. And I was a little bit late doing laundry, and it's still wet. So we're going to make it through. Hopefully the red doesn't throw anybody off. All right. Well, why don't we jump in? This is episode number 12. And today we're talking about grief. And I say that grief sucks because it does. I decided to make or create this episode today because from a personal standpoint, I and my family are coming up on the 4-year anniversary of my brother Alex passing. And so usually around this time of year, we're in September of 2023, you get the emotions going, and you kind of reflect back on that day that you found out, and kind of leading up to it, and reflecting back on some of your thoughts and feelings that happened after you found out. And ultimately, all of that is grief. And so I unfortunately am not the only person that has gone through this process. And if you haven't gone through this process, wanted to share some more information about grief, and then also to share information about grief with those that have gone through it, because Sometimes it's hard to navigate and to understand your thoughts and your feelings and what's going on, and you may not have a full understanding of everything that is going on. And so I just wanted to cover that. And so really, grief is just an emotion, and it touches the lives of countless individuals. It's an intricate, multifaceted experience, and it typically arises when we lose somebody that we care deeply about. So tonight, we're going to kind of dive in and talk about the nature of grief, what the various stages of grief that it encompasses, and then talk about some of the challenges that individuals face when they are coping with loss and as they go through the grieving process. So that's what we're going to do. So buckle up, and why don't we go ahead and jump in? Excuse me. So grief can be described as a complex emotional response to the loss of someone or something significant. It's not limited to the death of a loved one. So people can also grieve the loss of relationships. So let's say maybe you go through a breakup with your significant other, or maybe for whatever reason you have a strained relationship with a family member or a friend. And when you go through that, you can experience grief. You can also experience grief due to the loss of opportunities, the loss of health. So maybe you're diagnosed with a medical condition, or maybe there's something that's going to affect the way of it's going to affect the way of living for you. So you can grieve that. And also you can grieve, your kind of sense of identity. So it's a universal human experience, but one that is intensely personal, meaning that it's going to appear in your life uniquely compared to how others may experience it. So not every person experiences grief in the same way. So the process of grieving is often characterized by different stages that help us better understand and navigate the emotional terrain. The stages kind of give a framework for better understanding the journey through grief. And the most important, or not, I apologize, not the most important, but the most commonly cited stages were proposed or created by a psychiatrist by the name of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And we've probably heard them, but we're going to go through the 5 stages. So I'll go over what they are and then a brief synopsis of each of the stages. So the 5 stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So now that we have the 5 stages in mind, why don't we go through each of them a little bit more in detail? So stage 1, denial. The denial phase is characterized by the person's initial reaction to their significant loss. And during this phase, individuals will often have difficulty accepting or believing that the loss has occurred. And in this phase, the individual may exhibit behaviors and thoughts that include shock and disbelief. So they may initially feel numb and that they're unable to grasp the reality of the loss. They might believe it's a mistake or even a bad dream. They also may exhibit behaviors of avoidance. So some individuals may actively avoid situations, places, or even reminders that are associated with the loss. And this is done to help shield themselves from painful emotion that it brings. So with avoidance behaviors, an individual, for example, might not go to a restaurant that them and their significant other had, their first date. And let's just assume that the significant other has passed on. They may avoid that place, or, songs or music or things that remind them of the individual, because it brings back to the forefront of their mind the painful emotions of the loss. So they avoid it. Other behaviors that may be exhibited for denial would be minimization. So denial can also involve downplaying the significance of the loss. And this is when the individual works to convince themselves that it's not as bad as it seems. When Alex passed, I didn't go through a minimization phase, but I could see in a personal relationship, like let's say you broke up with your significant other, you might downplay the breakup, telling yourself that maybe now you're better off because of X, Y, and Z. So that might be a form of minimization. And then the last behavior that may be exhibited could be isolation. So people may withdraw from others and then become a little bit emotionally distant as they're working to process their emotions and to come to terms with their loss. So once you once we process the denial phase, we move on to anger, step 2. And in the stages of grief, the anger phase is a common emotional reaction that often follows denial. And during this phase, individuals may experience intense feelings of frustration. They may experience resentment and even anger. And this anger is typically directed at various targets or even situations, and it serves as a way for individuals to cope with the overwhelming emotions that they're feeling due to the loss. So some of the common aspects of the anger phase is that people may look to place blame. So they may look for someone or something to blame for the loss, whether it's another person, whether they're blaming fate or even a higher power. And placing blame for the loss of a loved one can be very complex, right? And it can also be very emotional. And it involves a lot of different factors and coping mechanisms. And here are some examples of what blame might look like when somebody is dealing with grief and in the anger stage. So, for example, blame may be placed on medical professionals. So if a loved one passes away due to a medical condition, for example, some family members may place blame on the doctors or the healthcare providers for either misdiagnosis, negligence, or, like inadequate treatment. In accidents, individuals may place blame directly toward the individuals involved in the accident, such as the driver. In substance abuse, a loved one's death that is linked to substance abuse, family members might blame the person themselves for their addiction, or they may blame friends and acquaintances who enabled the behavior. Unfortunately, blame can also be placed on family dynamics. So blame within families where members may blame each other for not doing enough to prevent the loss, or they may place blame on family members for contributing to the deceased person's struggles. And then in the event of suicide, when somebody takes their own life, blame can be placed on various individuals or factors. So the blame can be placed on potentially the mental health professionals, on friends, and even family members who may not have recognized the signs of distress. So other common aspects of the anger phase, including blame, can also include irritability. So Grief-related anger can lead to increased irritability and short-tempered behavior. Small frustrations may trigger strong reactions. And, I've experienced this one a little bit, just kind of like getting really frustrated at things that shouldn't frustrate me, or I should say traditionally don't frustrate me. And it's not something that I'm even aware of in the moment. So, I may be short-tempered or have some irritability, but in the moment I'm not aware of why I'm irritable or short-tempered. It usually takes some time for me to reflect back on things and to say, okay, this is why I might have lashed out a little bit, which actually takes us into the third action that people may take in the anger phase, which is lashing out. And in this phase, individuals might express their anger by lashing out at others, even if those people aren't directly related to the loss. It's just a way for the person coping to kind of vent, for lack of a better word, even though probably not appropriate, right? The fourth factor in the anger stage is that people can become upset with themselves. So there's internal anger. Some may internalize their anger, leading to self-criticism, to guilt, or even shame for feeling this way. So maybe this individual is taking it very, very hard on the loss, and they start self-criticizing themselves. They start feeling guilty that maybe they didn't do more, or that they could have or should have done more. And then the fifth aspect in the anger phase could be sense of injustice. So people in this phase of anger may feel that the world is unfair, or that they've been treated unfairly by life. The third step in the grief process is bargaining. And in the stages of grief, the bargaining phase is marked by a person's attempt to negotiate or to make deals in an effort to cope with the loss that they're experiencing. It's a way for them to seek control in an uncontrollable situation. And during the bargaining phase, individuals exhibit various thoughts and behaviors. And some of those thoughts and behaviors include if-only statements. So people may find themselves making statements like, if only I had done this differently, or if only they had received better medical care. These statements reflect a desire to change the outcome of a loss. Other thoughts and behaviors could be to seek compromise. And individuals that are in this phase may attempt to strike a deal with a higher power, with fate, or even with the universe. They might promise to change their own behavior or to make sacrifices in exchange for reversing the loss. This is not likely common in situations of death, because we're not going to be able to reverse that situation. But, in other forms of grief, like, for example, if you broke up with your significant other, you may seek compromise to promise to change the way that you act in certain situations, so that your significant other will want to come back, and so you may try to strike a deal and say, hey, if this person comes back, I will do X, Y, and Z. So you're seeking to compromise to change the situation. And then the third thought and behavior within the bargaining phase is exploring alternatives. So during the bargaining stage of grief, individuals will often seek ways to regain control or make sense of the loss. And they do this by exploring alternatives which is a common part of this process. And so some of the examples of exploring alternatives would be in medical treatment. If the loss was due to a terminal illness, for example, the individual may research alternative or experimental treatments, seeking hope for a cure or even an extension of life. Changing of lifestyle. So after a loss, individuals may consider making significant lifestyle changes, such as adopting a healthier diet, starting an exercise regimen, or pursuing new hobbies. And this is done as a way to regain a sense of control over their life. People may engage in support groups and counseling. And seeking out support groups or counseling can be an alternative approach to navigating the grief process. It provides space to share your feelings, and it also allows you to share strategies with others who have experienced similar loss. The other thoughts and behaviors could include acts of service or charity. So some individuals channel their grief into positive actions by engaging in acts of service or charitable work. They may create or support organizations related to the cause of their loved one's loss. They may also engage in symbolic rituals. And so when people are engaging in symbolic rituals, they develop or participate in ceremonies and rituals as alternatives to cope with their grief. And some examples of symbolic rituals could include creating a memorial, planting a tree, or organizing an annual event in the memory of the deceased. And then the last thought and behavior under bargaining would include education and advocacy. So exploring different alternatives may also involve educating oneself about the specific circumstances of the loss, whether it's a medical condition, through addiction or accident, and then becoming an advocate for awareness or change in that related area. The fourth step of the grieving process is depression. And in the stages of grief, the depression phase, which is also referred to as the depressive phase, is typically characterized by deep sadness, and a profound sense of loss. During this phase, individuals will experience a wide range of emotions and behaviors, which may include intense sadness. So people in the depression phase often feel overwhelmed by their sadness, and they may have frequent bouts of crying, which is perfectly okay. They may have intense feelings of hopelessness. So there is a sense of hopelessness and despair about their future. They may withdraw. So grief-related depression can lead to social withdrawal and a lack of interest in activities or relationships that were once enjoyable. So you may not have the want to hang out with your friend group like you did prior to the loss, or you may not enjoy doing certain activities as a result of the loss as well. You may have additional feelings of fatigue and lethargy. And that's because grief can be physically and emotionally exhausting. It's just overwhelming, and it's something that causes your brain to think uncontrollably about the situation for extended periods of time. And when this happens, it can lead to feelings of fatigue and just lack of energy. It can also include difficulty in concentrating. So it could become challenging to focus or to proceed with tasks or making decisions during the depression phase of grief. It can also lead to loss of appetite, or it can also lead to overeating. So grief affects eating habits, and it can lead to changes in appetite. This could be either a loss of interest for food, or you eat or you overeat, and you're using that as a coping mechanism. And then finally, in the depression phase, you may have sleep disturbances. So people may experience difficulties sleeping, such as insomnia or oversleeping. And that leads us into the fifth stage, which is acceptance. And in the acceptance phase, in the grief process, it represents a significant milestone. During this phase, individuals will begin to come to terms with the reality of their loss, and they will find a way to move forward in their lives. And here are some key aspects of the acceptance phase. Acknowledgement of the loss. People in this phase have accepted that the loss is real and it is permanent, and they no longer deny or try to bargain to change the situation. Emotional stability. While sadness and grief may still be present, individuals in the acceptance phase are often experiencing a more stable emotional state. They've learned to manage their emotions, and they've learned how to better integrate the loss into their everyday life. They may have a renewed interest in the future. So acceptance brings a sense of hope and the ability to look toward the future with some optimism. And in this phase, people may even begin to consider new goals and possibilities with their life. They may look to have more re-engagement with their life. Individuals start to resume normal activities. They resume their relationships. And even though they may never be the same as they were before the loss, they start getting back into their routine, both for their activities that they enjoy or that they learn to enjoy or that they find, as well as in the relationships that they hold. They also work to integrate memories. So the memories of the person or thing that was lost are integrated into the person's life in a way that allows them to cherish and remember those memories without being overwhelmed by grief. And lastly, there can even be personal growth in the acceptance phase. Some individuals find that they've grown and that they've learned from their grief experience, and that they've gained resilience and a deeper understanding of themselves, and the way that they are able to process difficult situations. It's important to note that acceptance doesn't mean that you forget or you completely get over the loss. Grief is a complex and it's a very individual process. And the acceptance phase represents a shift towards healing and adapting to life without your loved one or the source of grief. But it doesn't mean that you're over it. It's also probably worth mentioning that people may move in and out of different phases of grief, and acceptance can be a cyclical process rather than a linear one. So now that we have gone through the 5 stages of grief, why don't we talk about some of the challenges that individuals face as they are coping with grief? Because grief is seldomly straightforward, and there are so many factors that can they're going to complicate the grieving process. So some of those factors that may challenge your ability to cope with grief include, number 1, individual differences. And that is just saying that each person's grief journey is unique. It's influenced by factors like your personality, your ability to cope, and past experiences. And so if you are going through the grieving process and it doesn't seem to be similar to somebody else who may be or may have gone through the grieving process, that's perfectly okay. Not everyone's grief process is going to look exactly the same. Additional challenges in coping with grief include duration. And this is because grief has no timeline. It's not going to be done in 2 months, 6 months, a year, or even in multiple years. Because of this no timeline of when grief ends, the indefinite nature of that can be frustrating, and it can also be exhausting for those who grieve. Speaking from my own experience, obviously when the loss first happens, it's just, incredibly overwhelming. And you're not sure that you're ever going to get over the overwhelming, sadness that you're having. And then a little while later, you might have days where you're feeling better. And then you start feeling better and better. And then just randomly, a wave of emotion will hit you. And it's just out of the blue, and you're not sure why it comes in at that point. But it can be exhausting when you think you're doing pretty good, and then you have this big wave of sadness or grief come over you, and you're like, man, I thought I was, doing a little bit better. And so that can be exhausting. Some additional challenges in coping with grief include social expectations. And this one is just that, society often has these unwritten expectations about, how long we should grieve or what constitutes normal grief. I'm gonna air quote normal in that situation. And because of these unwritten expectations and these thoughts of how long one should or shouldn't grieve, it can lead to feelings of isolation or inadequacy, especially when people don't conform to these expectations. So let's say you are grieving for quote unquote a longer period of time than what is quote unquote normal. You may feel isolated because you are going against the norm, or maybe you don't grieve for as long as you're supposed to. And people might, you think that you're inadequate because you didn't grieve as long as you should have for the loss. The fourth challenge in coping with grief is that you can experience secondary losses. And this isn't necessarily like, hey, I've lost someone and then I'm going to lose somebody else, but it's more that it can lead to these secondary losses, like the loss of friendships or financial stability or a sense of purpose. And so your loss of a loved one, for example, could lose to additional losses within your life that you might not have foreseen. So maybe your significant other was, the main income earner in your household. And now that they're gone, you are forced to get back into the workforce or whatnot. And you're not used to the financial differences to when your loved one was around. And so there may be some additional losses there that are associated with the loss of your loved one. And these additional losses can really intensify the grieving process. And then the fifth challenge in coping with grief is something called complicated grief. And complicated grief is also known as prolonged grief disorder. And this is a condition where the process of grieving becomes prolonged and it becomes more intense. So it makes it incredibly difficult for individuals to cope with the loss, and it becomes incredibly difficult for the individual to move forward. Some of the symptoms that are included with complicated grief are intense and persistent longing. So individuals often experience an overwhelming and persistent longing for the person that has been deceased. They may constantly think about the person, talk about them, or even have vivid dreams about them. They may also have preoccupation with the loss. So the grief becomes the central focus of their life. And this makes it challenging to engage in daily activities, in completing work, or even in maintaining relationships. The person and some of the symptoms of complicated grief can include difficulty accepting the death. So we talked about, bargaining and anger, but, unlike the natural progression of grief, those that are dealing with complicated grief may really struggle to accept the reality of the loss. They may deny or just have a sense of disbelief about the death, and it's one that it lingers. It's not one that goes away. They may have intense emotional pain, and this pain remains intense and unrelenting over an extended period of time, which they typically will say lasts more than 6 months after the loss. They may experience avoidance of reminders. So individuals that are living with complicated grief, they actively avoid situations, places, or people that remind them of the deceased, as it will intensify their emotional distress. So we talked about avoidance earlier. And again, a person may avoid some of those things initially because of the emotion that is associated with it. But with complicated grief, the individual may avoid those situations altogether for extended periods of time, including extended periods of time that could include multiple years. They may socially distance or isolate themselves, so they may withdraw from social activities and even relationships. But this is, those living with complicated grief, it's going to be more severe and persistent than somebody that may just be going through some of the grieving stages. The individual may exhibit signs of difficulty in moving forward. So those with complicated grief are going to struggle to adapt to life without the deceased person, and they're going to find it extremely challenging to envision a future without them. And this is going to again last for extended periods of time. They may also exhibit excessive guilt or self-blame related to the death, or they may feel responsible in some way. They're going to have intense anger and bitterness. And the intense anger and bitterness, it could be directed at themselves, it could be directed at others, and it could even be directed at the individual who has passed. And then there are also some physical symptoms that are associated with complicated grief. And typically these symptoms are going to be fatigue, insomnia. It could lead or they could have headaches and stomach aches. What I will say about complicated grief is that it is a distinct mental health condition. And if you are going through the grief process and you think that you might have complicated grief, it may be good to get a professional intervened, somebody like a grief counselor or seeing a therapist to help you work through some of these complex emotions and to help find ways to cope with the loss. And so, again, if you or someone you know who is experiencing these symptoms and are struggling to cope with grief, please talk to somebody to help you out. So those are our stages of grief, and those are some of the challenges in being able to cope with grief. The one thing that I wanted to say is to give you a little bit of insight into my journey through grief. And I'm not going to spend much time here because you probably don't want to hear a ton about it. And and that's okay. But what I will say is that one of the things that I struggled with in the grieving process is that sometimes when we're growing up and we're learning about grief and we're learning about loss, sometimes I think we're taught that it's going to be linear. I believe I'm using that correctly. But going from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, right? That we're going to have the denial phase, and then we're going to move to anger, and then we're going to get to bargaining, and then we're going to get to depression, and then we're going to get to acceptance. And once we get to acceptance, we're not going to feel those feelings of sadness, or we're not going to go and experience symptoms from the depressive stage or the anger stage or the stage where we're in shock and can't believe that this is happening. And so having learned that, and then going through the experience when I found out that Alex had passed, I just expected that, over time I'd get better and then it would just be over with. And what I'm learning is that the grieving in general, doesn't end. And it's not one that you are completing check boxes to move to the next step. I'm going to put a graphic up on the screen for those that are watching. But we kind of feel like we're going to progress from step 1 to step 2 to step 3 to step 4, and then we're going to finish on step 5, right? But really, grief is just this huge squiggly line between all of the different stages, and that it's perfectly okay that is the case. That it's okay if one day you are accepting of the loss, and that you are coming to terms with reality, and that you're moving forward in your life. And then it's also okay that the very next day you are reminded of your loved one, of a memory or a place or something that you've done together, and that intense sadness comes on. And then it's also okay if you get to the point where you then go back to accepting. And I guess what I'm trying to say after all of this rambling is that it's okay if you're not going step by step, and that it's okay if your days are different, and that you're feeling sad, and probably feeling sad is okay. And it's probably a good thing, because it's a reminder of how much the person meant to you and how much they still mean to you. And I'm coming to terms with the thought that the grieving process will never end. And part of me is happy about that, because it means that my love for my brother, or your loved one, isn't going to end. And that they will always be a memory. And they'll always be a part of you. Grief is profound, and it's also an intricate emotion that accompanies loss. It can take on various forms. It defies a strict timeline, and it challenges individuals in numerous ways. And if you have gone through the grieving process, you know how challenging it can be. But as we understand the stages of grief and the hurdles faced by those coping with loss, It's a way for us to better understand and to offer support and empathy to others who grieve. As a society, I think it's our responsibility to recognize the significance of grief and to provide the space and the compassion that's necessary in order for individuals to heal. And so, as we think about grief, the next time you encounter somebody who may have or who may be dealing with the loss of someone, I would just say be patient with the individual. Know that we're all on our own different timelines, and that we're all experiencing things in different ways, and that there's no right or wrong way to grieve. What works for you might not work for somebody else, or how you might experience loss is going to be different than somebody even in your own family. So let's be kind, let's be empathetic, and let's just be there for those who are dealing with things in their life. And I guess ultimately what we're trying to do in the world is to be, and to inspire good in all that we do. That's it for this episode of Take 10. I appreciate you joining me on this journey, and we look forward to seeing you next time on the Take 10 podcast. Thank you. Goodbye.